So, like, what are we talking about when we make games and brands, right? And what's at work with that? Well, I'll take an example of a game we did. This was Walking Dead: Dead Reckoning. It was a game that we made and released on the web and on iOS and on the Android market. It was a top-ranked game in the iOS and Android market space in the free apps. I did not monetize because it was not intended to monetize, but it got a lot of users. And the design of this experience was actually like kind of a specific design that came out of like trying to make the brand real. Because the idea was that the game existed within the show's narrative universe. The idea was that the game was meant to bridge part of that universe, and specifically to look at the character of Shane, who on the television show was really the prime mover of a lot of the action in the pre-show history, and show some of that pre-show history. Particularly, it was designed to tell the story of how the zombie apocalypse happened, which is never really shown in the Walking Dead universe. But this was actually considered part of the canon. So you get to like walk through an experience of like what it was like to see people first reacting to the zombie apocalypse, and particularly to see how Shane reacts to the beginning of the zombie post-apocalypse. But because it's a game, we wanted to put the player in the position of feeling that. And so what we wanted to do was represent in the narrative the way that you might feel were a zombie apocalypse to start. Most notably, what if you were faced with someone that you cared about who either was becoming a zombie or knew someone who was becoming a zombie, and how would you respond to that? Which is a really hard thing to do in a game when you think about it, because everybody who knows a zombie story knows shoot zombies in head. So the second in a game anybody becomes a zombie or is threatened to become a zombie, you shoot them in head. And there's no real emotional resonance to that. So the trick to making this narrative experience correct was trying to build a set of mechanics that would cause you to actually feel the hesitancy you would genuinely feel if suddenly your lover or your father or your child became a monster. And that's basically what we did. And we did it through a kind of interactivity that you can see here through, like choice selection as you try to navigate these spaces, and by deliberately misleading the player in certain places. And I think that that kind of strategy is the way that games and brands work well. And in the examples I'm going to talk about today, it's going to come up over and over again that like I think the brand experiences that work best with games are where the mechanics of the game speak to the brand in some meaningful way. Because then playing the game makes sense in the narrative of the brand. It's like you're not just playing a game that happens to have Hunger Games slapped on it. You're playing a game that speaks to the narrative of the Hunger Games. So when you play it, you think of the Hunger Games and you feel like you're part of the story. And in this case, since this story is actually part of the canon of the television show of Walking Dead, you are literally participating in the story. So I think that the design of branded games, when they're done well, is to look at the brand itself and then to figure out, okay, well, what's the story, what's the experience, what's the emotional resonance we want to tell with the brand, and how do we design a set of game mechanics that can speak to that experience. But what's also important to point out here is that the game served a purpose, right? And the purpose primarily in this case was that Walking Dead does not go on continuously. There are breaks within the seasons. And there's a desire to keep the brand alive between the seasons that the game is made for. And that's often what we see games used for in this context. It's games as brand extension, right? Extension in the literal sense of like we're going to take the brand and we're going to stretch it to cover more space. And that serves a couple of different purposes that I'll talk about later, but one of the primary ones is just that we can't keep brands in people's minds all the time, and particularly with brands that need large breaks. This is very common in entertainment. So with music or with movies or with television, because there are gaps between the times you can experience the narrative and the brand, we create experiences that bridge them. And so this game was designed to either be released, and because we worked on different properties for AMC, there were different things we did with them, either to be released between television seasons so that a user who was interested in the property could continue to consume the property while the television show wasn't on, or it was designed to coincide with the release of a new season as a way to sort of market the new season. But in all cases, it was designed to be within the spirit of the show. So that's a very typical use of this. And I think that that's actually, there's nothing wrong with that use. But as someone who's been designing games for a long time and working with games and brands for a while, I really do wonder if that's the only really useful way we can use games with brands. And in fact, I think that there are a lot of opportunities to use games with brands that we're not exploring, or that we're exploring in very limited ways that I think have a lot of potential. And for that, I like thinking of a different example. And this example comes from Disney. And so Disney, Disney has a lot of of tendrils that kind of go to lots of different places. There's a lot of companies in the world that are basically second-party Disney companies. And one of them was a company called Creature Feep, based out of Chicago. And Creature Feep was interested in making a game for Disney as part of Disney's interactive studio division. And so they thought that what might be interesting is to make a physics game, but a physics game that was different than other kinds of physics games that might get some attention in the iOS marketplace. So they based it on this idea of water. Like, what if you had the physics of moving water around? You know, and so like if we made a game where like water would flow and it would have certain kind of controls, right? So water typically flows down, but if it hits a certain kind of pump, it can shoot up. And then we'll make something that's really simple to do on the iOS marketplace, which is like, okay, I need to touch this thing. So maybe if there's dirt and I remove the dirt and that creates flow patterns for the water, that could be interesting. And they found they had a mechanic they kind of liked, but they realized that to market this mechanic through Disney, they really needed to like have a narrative attached to it. And in fact, the team of Creature Feep was particularly interested in building a character for Disney. They worked with Disney, right? So the idea that they could make a character and have Disney's support behind it was amazing. And so they started to experiment with a narrative. And the narrative was Swampy the alligator. I don't know how many of you have ever played this game, but like Swampy the alligator doesn't like to get dirty. He's a sewer alligator, but he's obsessed with cleanliness. And when you play the game, you're basically helping him take showers so he can clean himself. And they built a whole narrative around this with an enemy and a love interest. And they kind of threw this into this puzzle game that really, absolutely didn't need it. You could have just sold it without it. But they put the attention into this. And the game that they came up with was Where's My Water, which became a top seller in the iOS marketplace. It became a top seller with its sequel. It became a cloned game within Disney because they eventually used it with other narrative properties. And so the game as a success case was pretty strong. They also sold it, right? And so they made the money from a premium sale on this game. But that's actually not why Where's My Water is interesting to me. The reason why Where's My Water is interesting to me is because you can now buy plush toys of Where's My Water through Disney properties. And if you go on a Disney cruise or if you go to Disney World, you can see a Swampy walking around in a big costume, and kids will play with that Swampy. And in fact, there are on YouTube 12 episodes of Swampy's Underground Adventures, which is a narrative based on Swampy. So what's really fascinating to me about this is that a small studio in Disney basically took a little bit of money relative to what it would cost to make an animation and put together a game that monetized. So the thing made money from the very beginning. But that thing that made money became a brand. And then that brand got pushed back out into Disney universe, and now it's consumed in every way that Disney creates anything. So what Disney got on the cheap was a new character, which is the bread and butter of what Disney does. That, to me, is really fascinating. And what's particularly interesting to me about it is the way it came about, because we can look at this construction, right? Like basically, Creature Feep came up with a puzzle game, and then they needed a narrative to attach to it, and they decided to push on that narrative. But there's absolutely no reason why we couldn't do that in reverse. Why couldn't we think of a character that we think is kind of interesting, then come up with a game mechanic for it and push the game out, and then see if that has traction? Because the cost of doing this is so much lower than the cost of doing a full animation. So what if we didn't think of games always as extensions of brands? What if the idea wasn't that the brand was there to push the game forward and we were just going to commercialize on the brand? What if we thought about games as a method for brand invention, right? A cheap way to circulate a brand out into the public so that we could test it and get a market response to it. And if that's successful, then we can push it forward into other spaces. The reason why this interests me is because then we can start to think about games as a larger part of a brand lifecycle as a whole. It's not just that games are used to take something that currently exists and market it or commercialize it. It could be that games exist in every part of the brand cycle. Games could be used as early experiments to test concepts cheaply. Games could be used as steps in the story that are equal parts to other narrative elements. And this is where Transmedia exists. And there are lots, and you wouldn't know about it from inside the game industry, but there are lots of people who are just thinking about this exclusively. The reason why LucasArts basically self-destructed and reformed is because, I'll talk about Star Wars again in a second, is because LucasArts realized that with a new Star Wars film coming out, the method they were using to market Star Wars properties, which is basically stamp Darth Vader onto everything on the face of the earth, didn't make sense, right? Because there's a new movie to market. And so they basically let go of most of the staff who were working on the games and rehired up from a transmedial perspective with a design that's going to just push the movie forward with every piece of property. But LucasArts realizes now that putting out a new Star Wars movie just as a movie is a mistake. that if you're going to put out a new Star Wars movie now, you have to put out a new Star Wars universe, and the universe is going to cover everything Star Wars covers, which is comics, which is television shows, which is webisodes, which is press releases of cast photos, which is games. And all of that's part of one enterprise around the brand. And then, of course, we will continue to have games as external elements to expand fan bases and bridge series gaps. Right? We can still use games for all those purposes, and I'm not knocking them. Some of these games have been, as we'll see in a second, wildly successful. But that's not the only way we can use games. And I think if we can think about games through this whole brand life cycle, we finally get to the heart of what we mean when we actually say transmedia, which now has become this disgusting buzzword that is effectively a checklist of everything you have to do to get your marketing department to be happy with you when you release a brand thing. So do you have your game? Do you have your website? Do you have your app? Do you have your movie? Do you have a comic? Check, 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 check. Transmedia done, which is silly because these things have purposes, right? But if we start to understand their purposes, we can see where they fit into the full experience. So it's easier to look at this in detail if we go backwards, so I'll start with the one that's the easiest. Brand extension. Brand extension really serves two purposes in a broad sense, and you just have to understand which one you're working with if you want to work into the space. And I'm not trying to tell people in the media space how to market their stuff. I'm speaking as a game developer about how I understand what I do. So if you come to me and you say, hey, I have this television show and I want to make a game about it, the very first question I'm going to ask you is this marketing or is this commercial? Because they're very different structures. When you think about things for marketing purposes, you're basically saying that, like, OK, I have this IP and the IP is good, and I want to take that IP and I want to show it to a new audience. Because the audience that watches TV is already watching TV. So I don't really actually have to catch them on the television show. Like, it would be like showing commercials for my show during my show. It doesn't really make sense. Like, you're already there. But it's possible that someone who might be interested in my show just doesn't naturally go to the television show right now. Or someone who watches movies, who might watch my movie, might not be looking at movie leads and movie trailers and movie news. But they might be playing games. So if I make a game for them, I might catch a bunch of people who never would have thought that my property was going to be interested. In this case, it's critical that the game get adopted, but it doesn't really matter if it monetizes. Because that's not your purpose. Your purpose is to drive it back to the game. Now, I would question why you wouldn't try to monetize every single thing you make, but it's entirely possible in this case that if really what you want to do is get more people to watch Jersey Shore, you don't really care if you make money off a game that gets more people to watch Jersey Shore. And in that case, you want to keep the barrier as low as possible. And the development costs here are just really tied to platform and reach. It's just like, what platform are you working on and who do you want to reach? And that's an audience question. Are you looking at a demographic that primarily plays on mobile? Are you looking at a demographic that primarily plays on Steam? You know, like, and those will have different scopes because you want a game that's going to be competitive into those spaces. That's kind of what we did with Red Bull Focus. The idea behind this game was Red Bull was interested in pushing its marketing campaign to a new group of users, and it was users interested in gameplay. And so we made a game that would just promote the message branding. It doesn't even have a particular narrative direction in it, although you can see the woman surfing in this, and that's where Red Bull's branding is. It's all about extreme athletes right now. So we made a game, and I picked this screenshot because I think it sort of shows everything we're trying to communicate, a game where you travel across the world, you see people in these athletic events, you play a competitive experience that's trying to showcase your skill and your ability, and we put it into a slick interface. That's tied to the branding of the game. So we're actually, this is all of these colors and these fonts are drawn from the marketing branding. So this game exists as an object in the brand strategy of Red Bull as a way to push that message out. We didn't sell it because Red Bull didn't care about making money off of this. They just wanted the brand identity to be strong. On the other hand, you can make these games as commercial experiences, and in that case, you're really trying to exploit the brand to monetize the audience more. This is always more expensive and it's always more involved because if you're trying to make money off of people by selling a game, you are competing against all the other games that make money. And having the brand is an advantage, but games have shown over and over and over again that that advantage will not supersede bad game design. Because when people have time to play something, they will play the good thing. They'd love to play the good thing with the brand. And if you give them a comparison between the good thing that doesn't have the brand and the good thing with the brand, they will play the brand. But if the thing that the brand is bad, they won't stick with it. And this doesn't make it for automatic success for that reason, but a good game tied to an appropriate category can be very successful. I mean, the obvious example is this one. But this game is good. I mean, if you haven't played it yet, that's the thing you have to realize, is this game is good. It actually hits what you want about Kim Kardashian's life. Because if you like Kim Kardashian, you like it because she's just a crazy gossip machine of like celebrities and scandal and really fascinating weird turns in these sort of private public experiences. And what the game does is it lets you do all of that. So if you're looking to experience the brand of Kim Kardashian, this is a wonderful way to do it. And this game is making tons of money. But it's not all that shocking when you realize that it fulfills what I was talking about before. It creates an experience that replicates the brand. But I mean, you don't have to do anything at that, like it doesn't have to be scaled like that, and it doesn't always have to be narrative that way. This was a game that, one of the original games that was put out for the Hunger Games called Panem Run, which is effectively temple runs set in the Hunger Games universe, but you shoot arrows to hit targets and you run through the districts. And I think this is a really interesting example of a much simpler kind of experience in terms of its push that speaks to the narrative universe. So if you play Panem Run, you're playing Katniss in a genuine experience of the way Katniss moves through the world. And that's another way to monetize it, because you monetize Hunger Games Panem Run the same way you monetize Temple Run. A second way to think about this is to think about the game itself as part of a brand development strategy. That the game, this is where, when we talk about transmedia, the game lives as part of the way the whole brand is released. And so for that purpose, the game is a core part of the narrative universe. It's not separate from the universe, and it's not an extension of the universe. It actually is a piece of the narrative universe. Playing the game is actually participating in the story, so the story exists there too. And why wouldn't you monetize on that? Right? Why wouldn't you find a way to make money on that? Because it seems to me that that's just as strong an instance of your narrative as anything else. We see this, for example, again with Star Wars. The Force Unleashed was, I think, one of the strongest examples of this, where they basically said, oh, there's this big gap between the last movie of the prequels and the first movie where all the Jedi die, so let's make a game that fills that gap. And again, this is all canon, right? This is accepted by Star Wars as part of the story. So if you actually want to understand all of the Star Wars story, you need to play Force Unleashed. And it's interesting that, that this game was really kind of built to be that narrative space. This was also done with The Matrix. It was also done with Chronicles of Riddick. Like, some hardcore games have tried to do this. But then, you know, like the stuff that we've done with AMC is basically the same thing. Like, this game, based on Jesse Pinkman, is set in the Breaking Bad universe, and it exists somewhere in the middle of season 3. But it's canon. Like, this is part of the story of Jesse Pinkman. So if you're interested in knowing the whole story of Jesse Pinkman, you need to play this game. And so the game exists as a part and parcel of the narrative universe. And I want to say, just this is a complete geeky aside, but Vince Gilligan is amazing at this stuff. Like, this is really one of the things he's strongest at. He oversaw every single thing that has ever been made for the Breaking Bad universe. He looked at and approved. Everything. So that's why that universe is so tight through all of its objects, is because he paid attention to it. And I think it's a really good lesson for how to do this well. Like, don't treat these things as throwaway. Build them into your experience, even if they're small. This was not an expensive thing to make, but it's quality. And it means that if you touch something in Breaking Bad, it's still quality. And then finally, there's this idea of brand invention, and that's, you know, use games as ways to incubate a new brand. I look at horror, I look at sci-fi, I look at fantasy, I look at detective shows, I look at thrillers, I look at soap operas, I look at historical melodramas, and I see over and over again genres where people play games. I see audiences that overlap game players, not the same game players, right? The soap opera people are not the sci-fi people, but the soap opera people have games and the sci-fi people have games, and they monetize those games like crazy, and they play those games a ton. So why couldn't we go to those audiences at a platform that's so much cheaper than a pilot for a television show, or so much cheaper than a first release focus test for a movie, and like give them a property they can play with? And if we see people are really interested in it when it's a cheap e-comic or a cheap mobile game, why don't we use that as an incubation platform to move something forward? I know people who work on pilots, and I know that these pilots can cost like $1 million to just get made, not even released, just made. $1 million sunk into something that never sees the light of day. How many mobile games is $1 million? How many e-comics is $1 million? Like, how many ways could we float balloons out into the market? Cheaply. And honestly, there really aren't much examples of this, but again, I look at Where's My Water, and I can't help but think that, like, what Creature Feet managed to do with Swampy when connected to a brand company that could really promote it is incredible. Right? And that was almost accidental. If we approach this with all the brand strategy we know, and we really tackle transmedia in a direct way, as thinking about this not just as a way to pull more money out of people who consume our property, which is awesome as long as they like it. Because as long as they're happy to give the money, they'll still love the brand. But what if we thought about games and interactive work and transmedia work in a general way as all part of an incubated process? It's all part of one process, which is to build a brand. So games don't just exist to extend the television show. Games exist because there's a brand, and the brand can live in as many forms as it can. And what we really want to do is find brands as cheaply and quickly as we can, exploit them early and build an audience, and then promote them through as many channels as possible. And that makes the fans happiest, that makes the developers happiest, that makes the distributors happiest, and it makes everybody money. So I just imagine a world where this cycle is something that we can think about in a deeper way. And games is what I happen to be talking about now, but I think this is true for transmedia in general. Like if we really start approaching things from a transmedial perspective, not a marketing checklist, but a strategy that's designed to exploit different media the way they work best, and that maximizes our resources so that we can find out what works and give it to people in ways they want to consume it. I think we have a vehicle to make brands more successfully, to make more brands, and to build bigger audience attention towards those brands. This is going to happen. Like in the next generation, this is the way things are consumed. And the fact that LucasArts has basically fired a bunch of people and hired transmedia people at their top tell me that Star Wars is thinking about this. I think every brand could benefit from this. And I can see a universe where this kind of transmedial strategy takes some of the guesswork out of brand creation and builds in more of the kind of community and messaging features and more of the strength of what fan communities can do from their earliest inceptions. Thank you.
I noticed that in one of the last slides you said that there are horror and sci-fi and soap opera aficionados who are playing games. I didn't notice comedy or humor as one of those genres.
Yeah, I think that comedy in games has always been really tricky, right? Because it's hard to do timing in games properly, so games have had a harder time with comedy, but I don't think it's impossible. I just think it's a harder game design challenge. Like the ones I don't think there's much you couldn't do with a transmedial construction. Maybe not always games as games will work, but things that are interactive, I think you'd always find a way to make them work, but comedy is harder. The ones I listed are the ones that I think are free. Like, using hidden object style gameplay to tell a soap opera is the most obvious thing to me in the universe, given that it is exactly the same demographic on both sides. So, and sci-fi and horror and stuff like that, it's just like, hopefully I don't have to explain that in a game conference, right? It's just like, I feel like those are super easy. But I think, yeah, I think comedy, I think there's potential for comedy. I think there's potential for literary narratives, too. I just don't think we've really tried to crack the nut very hard of how that storytelling could work.